That's it. So thank you very much for the introduction. So as I said, my name is Matthew Griffin. I'm the CEO and founder of the 311 Institute, the World Futures Forum, and Exponential University. So as a futurist and strategic advisor, I work with all G20 governments to invariably help them build the future of their countries. So that's especially the US, Europe, Middle East, as well as lots of different parts of Asia. I work with the vast majority of some of the world's most respected brands, basically like Samsung, Aeon, Arm, Intel, Huawei, Airbus, Novartis, basically on the healthcare front, and all kinds of different organizations, basically. So, when we start having a look at the future, what I've actually done here is I've put together a deck that will take us through a whole variety of different futures perspectives for your industries. So industries plural, but I've also included information basically on the future of leadership in what we sort of call exponential times. Now, what we mean by exponential times is we're already seeing the rate of change around us accelerating and accelerating and accelerating. So when we actually have a look at the future, quite a lot of the investor organizations that I work with invariably say, well, how complex is the future? Whether we're trying to predict probable, possible, plausible futures, preferable futures, and so on and so forth. Now, you've all got access to these particular codexes. So, for example, we've got a code. Oh, hello. Hello. Yeah. There you go. Yeah, that's it. See, the wonders of technology. So what I have here basically is if you want to scan the QR code, and we can send the video through later as well, there are 3 codexes. I've written 12, but these are the 3 that sort of might interest you the most. So we've got how to build exponential enterprises. So this takes you all the way through from what we'll discuss later, a blank sheet of paper, to launching your own disruptive organization or startup basically into the marketplace. So it's what some organizations refer to as the problem of crossing the chasm. You are here today, you want to get to the future that is over here. How do you do it? So the first codex helps you with that. The second codex goes through over 200 megatrends, what they are, why you should care about them, and what you can do to understand them more, but also in some ways counteract them or piggyback off them if you sort of like. The third codex is a technology codex. Now, this particular technology codex covers over 300 exponential technologies, which we can sort of have a quick chat about in a moment. When we have a look at the future of different technologies, you don't want to look at individual technologies. You want to look at how they can be combined together to create next generation products and services. So when we take just the trends alone, and the technologies alone, when you combine all these together, you get an infinite number of different combinations, which means that you get arguably an infinite number of different kinds of futures, basically, that you can actually build, envision, lead, and so on and so forth. So these are all written to be sort of fairly straightforward to understand and navigate, because one of the things that I try to do is democratize access to the future. And because the future is so complex and chaotic and speedy and all these other sorts of things, trying to get your head around basically all the different changes is very difficult. That's it. So I try to simplify that, and that's where these codexes come in. Now, when we actually have a look at the world that we live in today, opportunity is everywhere. Now, there are 2 ways that we can sort of look at opportunity. Now, from a current perspective, we can see lots and lots of different disruptive threats coming at us, whether it's from a professional perspective, an industrial perspective, or whether it's a country level perspective. But all of those threats to you and your business are actually opportunities. So the way that we look at the world that we live in today, let alone the future, is very, very important, because a threat to you is also an opportunity to you, but you need to be able to understand why it's a threat to you and then how you turn it to your advantage. So increasingly, we're living in an age of science fiction like startups. We see these absolutely everywhere. And from an organizational perspective, when we have a look at the Fortune 500, there are more organizations in the Fortune 500 that are going through this process of creative destruction than ever before. Now, when we have a look at creative destruction, what we mean by that is they are having a look at their own internal organizations, their external markets, and they are essentially trying to reinvent themselves from the core, whether it's processes, people, technology, and so on and so forth. Now, there's also this kind of misconception that the changes that you see within your own industries and your own markets are unique to you. But today we are seeing disruption across every single industry. And the types of disruption that we're actually seeing are not just incremental. They aren't doing what we used to do in a slightly new way. They are fundamentally disruptive, and they are disrupting the core of how businesses go to market, operate, scale, and so on and so forth. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So when we have a look at the global food industry, and when we have a look at the future of food, the food industry is a $8 trillion industry. Traditionally, if you wanted to create a chicken nugget, for example, you would grow a load of chickens, and then you would kill those chickens, you turn them into chicken nuggets. Now we can take a cell from an animal, put it into a technology called a bioreactor, and we can grow chicken nuggets. And we can do exactly that same process with any animal, and we can even do it with plants, which means that we can grow molecular coffee without the need for the actual coffee plant. We can create meat without the animal. So this is a core disruption. When we have a look at how we grow crops as well, traditionally we've always needed huge tracts of land, which is why we deforest Borneo, which is why we deforest Malaysia, which is why we deforest the Amazon. However, increasingly we can grow 8 times the amount of crops with 100% less harmful pesticides, chemicals, herbicides, and so on and so forth. We can grow crops with 100% less potable water because we can extract water for these vertical farms from the air. In addition to that, we enable food security, which allows us to feed over 2 billion people on the planet that go hungry. So even though agriculture doesn't look like it's moving or transforming, it's being disrupted, as I say, from the core. When we have a look at energy, exactly the same thing. We are moving from a fossil fuel-based energy economy to a renewable economy with over 1 trillion watts installed today. And we'll talk a little bit more about energy later. When we have a look at the global financial markets, we see big banks being disrupted by fintechs, and fintechs being disrupted by decentralized finance organizations, where, for example, if you have a look at Fortnite, which some of your kids might play, Fortnite has 350 million users. Now, when we have a look at things like Web 3.0, Fortnite could become a giant financial services organization. 95% of its revenues already come from microtransactions. Fortnite can be selling avatars. They could be selling NFT real estate, NFT mortgages. They can be enabling peer-to-peer financial transactions, all kinds of different things. So when we're actually talking to the global financial community, while they know DeFi is here, decentralized finance is here, they don't fully often appreciate that a lot of the large gaming platforms can be future banks, etc., etc., etc. Now, when we have a look at healthcare, healthcare is being transformed in staggering ways. By 2028, we will reach something called escape velocity, where new healthcare innovations will allow us to add more than 1 year's worth of life to you for every year that you've lived. In Israel, we have already managed to 3D print beating human hearts, miniature ones, but in about 10 years' time, these will be able to be transplanted into patients. We have in vivo gene editing, where we have powerful genetic engineering technologies that have allowed us to clip out the bad genes of people who have inherited genetic diseases, clip in new genes, and they no longer have those inherited diseases any longer. Just those 2 technologies increase our mortality substantially and start putting us on a path to seeing 125 being the new 60. And then when we have a look at transportation, transportation is being disrupted from the core as well. Every kind of vehicle that moves is increasingly becoming autonomous and electrified. And while these industries themselves represent around $40+ trillion worth of global value, we're just scratching the surface basically of how these industries are actually changing. So when we live in turbulent times like these, where everything around us is changing, where our own markets are changing, where how our own industries could operate or should operate are changing, this calls for a slightly different approach to leadership. So when we have a look at leadership from a futures perspective, speed matters. The reason why speed matters is because increasingly we can disrupt global markets like the global financial system in a single day now, particularly when we talk about digital businesses. So an example of this would be Facebook, who in June 2019 launched their cryptocurrency Libra. Had they been allowed by the regulators to release the Libra cryptocurrency into their platform, they could have had 500 million people using that new cryptocurrency by midday. They could technically have had everybody, 2.2 billion people, using their cryptocurrency by the end of the day. So leaders at the central banks, as well as the main banks, have gone on record to say that had Libra been able to be released into the market, it would have disrupted the global financial system overnight. So when we talk about the future, speed matters, and that also includes heavy asset industries. Now, when we have a look at all the different technologies that we have at our disposal today, and I'm not going to go into all of these are in the codexes that you have. This is a starburst. I track over 450 exponential technologies. Every single technology on this starburst, which goes across 13 different categories, has an addressable market opportunity of over $500 billion. And each individual technology can either disrupt an industry or every industry. So for example, we have 3D printing. That is one dot. We have artificial intelligence. That's one dot. Virtual reality, augmented reality, and immersive reality, kind of the metaverse. That's one dot. When you combine all these different technologies together, whether it's advanced manufacturing, whether it is compute, whether it is energy, whether it is communications with platforms like 5G and 6G coming through in about 2028, when you combine all of these different technologies together, the only thing that you do is transform every industry and every single corner of global culture and society. There is nothing that is left as the status quo. So, as I say, I'm not going to go into these because basically they're in the codexes, but if you have a look in the codexes, you'll see just how many significant technologies there are here today, which, when combined, are actually being used by your competitors, startups, inside your businesses, as well as outside of your businesses, to change how you function and how you operate and how you go to market, but also transform the markets that you're interested in. Now, according to organizations like ARK Investment, these emerging technologies are expected to destroy over $50 trillion worth of global value, global GDP. They are also expected to create up to $210 trillion of new market value, which means if you can get your heads around these new technologies and the new things that they help us create, you have a huge market opportunity ahead of you, depending on the sectors that you're interested in. So now today we kind of have this problem. Now we live in a time where risk is all around us, where change is all around us. and you have two options really as a business. You can either maintain the status quo, or you can look at the future as we are, try to understand what it means to you and your businesses, and then once you have your point of view and you've built out your new strategy and your new vision, move. Now, at the moment, basically, this means that today, not taking a risk is a risk. And I'll show you a whole variety of different reasons why in a bit. However, one of the biggest risks that organizations tell me about is they say, we are here today. We see that the future looks a bit like this. And while we like that future or we accept that future for better or worse, the problem that we have is understanding how we get from here to here. It's what most organizations call crossing the chasm problem. So the first book that I talked to you about, the How to Build Exponential Enterprises book, takes you from here to here. It is literally an A to Z roadmap. And I wrote it because I get so many different organizations saying that they have that problem, how to get from here to here. And actually, it's easier than you might think. It's cheaper than you might think. It's also less risky than you might think because we have different ways that we can de-risk this journey for you. So from a leadership perspective, we're now living in times where the only thing that we experience is business as unusual. From a business perspective, I would encourage you to literally try to live in the day after tomorrow. The reason for that is if you can envision the future, that's one thing. But to try and experience that future, that builds an emotional connection with the future. And then when you go and experiment with some of the technologies and things that I'm going to show you, this is where suddenly you appreciate their power, their impact, and the way that they can transform your business. So this is where we can also talk about creating different scenarios and the need to be serial inventors and enact serial innovation. So as a business, really I would encourage you to ask yourselves these three questions. So depending on the answers, this then can form part of your future strategy. So in the last 18 months, either as individual businesses or as a group, how many new products have you introduced? So this is important because increasingly this is where we are trying to create new products and introduce new products that are outside of your traditional core businesses. So this is sort of the first question. Secondly, how much of the company have you reinvented in the past 18 months? This is where we look at new growth engines. So if the answer to these first questions is either none, which I'd be a little bit surprised about, or not many, then you might want to look at those areas first and see and understand some of the things that you can do. Now, as the world around us accelerates, as it changes faster and faster and faster, even as a heavy asset business, you should also ask yourself this third question. Can you prove to yourselves and to the markets that you are able to move at speed? Now, what I mean by this is if you saw a new market opportunity, do you have the internal culture, processes, systems and technologies that would allow you to go and take advantage of that new market quickly? Now, with some organizations, when they see a new market opportunity, it can take them 2 to 3 years to go and move on that opportunity, by which point it's gone. There are other incumbents that have already grabbed that opportunity and now you're either a fast follower or you're a fast failer. So when we talk about being able to move at speed, this is where we talk about composable business. So this is where we talk about modular businesses, where you have teams that can spot the opportunity, quantify the opportunity. They have the right and the trust of the business, so they can talk to the leadership teams within the business, show the business these opportunities, and then once quantified quickly, the business then has all of the internal resources that it needs to go and try to move into that new market opportunity as quickly as possible. So that's developing minimal viable products, partnering with organizations and so on and so forth. So we need to move from hierarchies to networks of people within organizations. We need to move from industries to ecosystems. Ecosystems are incredibly important here, which I think you already appreciate. And we need to move from managers to leaders. Now, when we start looking at sustainability, which is going to be a thread throughout the rest of this presentation, firstly, when we have a look across your businesses, we have artificial intelligence that is being used to design new things that enable us to do new things. So, for example, we have artificial intelligences courtesy of organizations like Toyota that are now designing new aluminium alloys, as well as new materials, where those materials are really quite anything. So, for example, when we have a look at the cement business, have you been experimenting with artificial intelligence, and have you set artificial intelligence the task of trying to create new cement or new concretes that are maybe more environmentally friendly, that consume less energy to put together, and so on and so forth? Now, when we have a look at the creation of new aluminium alloys, we have already proven, even though these technologies are new, that artificial intelligence can design 2,000, 3,000 and even 7,000 new 2,000, 3,000, 7,000 alloys 200 times faster than human scientists have been able to do. So when I say that we're moving at speed in all areas of business, if you think about the aluminium business, you wouldn't necessarily think that it's moving at speed. But now we have artificial intelligences that can design and have designed new aluminium alloys 200 times faster than we could a year ago. These artificial intelligences are also increasingly good at finding new ways to eliminate waste, whether that's waste energy, waste materials, so on and so forth, so out of the production process. They're also very good at finding new material combinations, because they can crunch 25 million compounds together to come up with new compounds and new combinations of materials and things that perhaps do have new properties, that use less energy to create, fewer resources to create, and so on and so forth. And then this leads us sort of into the area of sustainable manufacturing, because, for example, if we can 3D print different materials, let's say, for example, we look at high tensile alloys with new powders, increasingly I'm able to 3D print new aluminium alloys, but I can, in some cases, use up to 70% less material without losing any tensile strength, without affecting those alloys' durability, and so on and so forth. So while some of these activities are more downstream from your smelting operations, have you experimented and looked at this area? Do you have a point of view? Even if you don't do anything about it, do you have a point of view? When we look at the circular economy is very much concerned with taking waste as a design flaw. Now, waste is also an opportunity. So when we have a look at things like carbon capture, whether it's in aluminium smelting, as well as cement production, there are some interesting things that we can do there, and I'll bring those in later. But when we actually have a look at zero liquid discharge, again, something we'll talk about later, we have new technologies that are already here today that are increasingly helping us use the materials that we can reclaim from wastewater discharge and use those in the manufacturing process, as opposed to sending them to landfill or wherever else we want to send them. We have the energy transition, which we'll speak about. And then from a business perspective, a lot of businesses talk about net zero, same with governments. However, bearing in mind that when we actually have a look at the aluminium industry, for example, increasingly there is a premium value on green aluminium. So aluminium produced basically using renewable energy sources and so on and so forth. So from a business perspective, on the one hand, have you embraced net zero? However, have you challenged yourselves to go beyond net zero and try to create a business that is net negative, let alone an organization that has a zero waste policy? Now, for example, last week I was in the Middle East, basically with the Middle East's largest construction company. They build cities, master communities, and all kinds of different things. And when we talk about net negative, for example, within the concrete and the cement industries or the construction industries, we actually have a way to create net negative communities. And I'll show you some of those. So if you push yourself beyond what everyone else is doing, sometimes what you'll find is actually it leads you into new market opportunities where your competitors aren't engaged, aren't even looking, which then means you can leap them, whether it's a generational leap in product development and innovation, or whether it's even 2 leaps ahead. So I'd at least encourage you to have a look at how would you become a net negative business, because there's also IP based in that, which you can actually sell and export and earn money from. So for example, when we have a look at companies like IBM, IBM makes $6.5 billion a year just from its IP portfolio. From a sustainability perspective, we talk about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. So scope 1 is where you look at minimizing the environmental impact of your own business first. Scope 2 is where we look at minimizing the environmental and CSR impact of your supply chain. And then scope 3 is where you look at minimizing the environmental and social impact of your products and your business from a consumer perspective as well. So this sort of leads us into that circular economy play. Now, from a packaging perspective, when we have a look at cement packaging or cement packaging and cement sacks, we have organizations like Tarmac, basically, that are now making plastic cement sacks using 50% recycled PET. Now, on the one hand, this is okay. It means that their cement sacks are greener, but not necessarily green, because we're still using virgin plastic, basically, in making those cement sacks. However, we now have other startups who are creating fully recyclable cement sacks using polypropylene. So these are literally, as they say on the tin, they are cement sacks, basically, that once emptied, you just recycle them and off we go, then you can reuse them. However, some of the sort of more interesting packaging innovations, basically within the cement industry, I mean, there are other innovations in other sectors, for example, the use of seaweed-based packaging and so on and so forth, but I'm not necessarily sure they will apply to you quite yet, but they could be interesting. We also have disappearing sacks. So for example, we have companies over in the United States that on the one hand create new cement sacks that allow them to capture carbon within those sacks. So these sacks are carbon negative. So remember I said about going carbon negative and seeing what you can do there. These sacks disintegrate in the mixer, which means that when you pour, traditionally you pour cement into a mixer and you get a cloud of cement dust basically in your face and everything else, which means you either have respiratory problems or you need health equipment, PPE, that kind of stuff. These, you just tip the entire sack into the cement mixer. Now, so there's no dust, they're also plastic free, and they actually bind with the cement, so they become part of the building itself. They become part of the construction material itself. So I'm going to show you a little video on this one, just to sort of prove the point. But there are some interesting... So now here's the interesting things. Because these cement sacks are carbon negative, why couldn't you as a business qualify for carbon credits when you're making these sacks? Now, from a carbon credits perspective, that means that you have a new income stream, which might be more than enough to cover all of the costs that you need to make those sacks. And then from a sack perspective, there is IP in this, and you could sell that. So just from a packaging perspective, there is a new market and a new revenue opportunity there. Let alone basically when we start talking about carbon credits, because carbon credits are going to become a lot more important after the IPCC's recent report from the United Nations that says the only way that we can now reverse climate change is by sucking carbon dioxide out of the air. Now, when we have a look at construction materials as well, cement was designed thousands of years ago, really, basically, sort of pre-Roman times. But we've got a lot of different ways that we can create construction materials today. So how many of these do you know about? Now, one of them, which is kind of a weird one, is something called biomineralization. So this is where we take a traditional, for example, building material like concrete, but we embed bacteria within it. Now, this lets us do a couple of interesting and strange things. So firstly, these bacteria, which can be used in bricks and concrete and all kinds of other things, firstly, they absorb carbon dioxide again. They are carbon negative. Remembering that if something is carbon negative, you can get carbon credits for it, which you might have to fight the regulators for because some of these are unprecedented, but nevertheless, if something's carbon negative, you can get carbon credits for it. Now, the other odd thing that we see here is biomineralized bricks, so more bricks than concrete for now, actually replicate themselves. So you have one brick made from bacteria and other materials, and there are videos on these. They literally replicate themselves. So you now have two bricks. So these are very sort of odd new materials that replicate themselves. So if you were able to industrialize that process, how much new material would you need to make versus the material that the bacteria make? So that's maybe worth getting a point of view on. But from going back to concrete, biomineralized concrete self-heals. So when we see these cracks in the building, the bacteria are exposed, they suck carbon dioxide out of the air, turn it essentially into limestone and other sort of minerals, and you now have a concrete-based building that is able to heal itself, which, bearing in mind that we talk about resilient infrastructure, is very important. We also have carbon negative concrete. There's only one company, as far as I've been able to identify, that's doing this. So in this particular case, we are using carbon that's been captured using carbon capture technologies. Bearing in mind, you could attach, you probably already have them, but you could attach carbon capture technologies to the vast majority of your factories, including the smelting plants. We can talk about that. So we take carbon that's been captured using CCS. We then take waste steel slag, and we now have a carbon negative concrete that is cement free. We can also eliminate calcium from concrete. And then this particular process is something called mineral carbonation. And again, because it's carbon negative, you could potentially get carbon credits. There's a theme here. Now, from this perspective, when you create a concrete CMU, normally you produce 2 kilograms of carbon dioxide per CMU. Using this technology, you suck up 1 kilogram of concrete per CMU. So it's, as I say, carbon negative. Now, per cement factory or per concrete plant, it's estimated this technology will enable you to remove over 20,000 tons of CO2. from your production facilities. When we have a look at green concrete, we've got new fly ash binders as well. So these are sort of carbon negative, but they are also less harmful to the environment. So some are carbon negative, some are almost carbon negative. So it does depend on the ones that we're talking about. But we also have a way, thanks to using fly ash, and fly ash comes from coal plants, and there are a lot of coal plants, especially in India, we can get rid of Portland cement. Now, we also have circular concrete. So when we look at circular concrete, obviously this is where we simply reuse, recycle and then reuse concrete that's in the wild, when we're tearing down buildings. Now, sort of when we start having a look at trying to 10x your business, so finding new ways basically to grow your business revenues by a lot, by up to 10x, or even by 10x, there's a number of things that we can do. So firstly, by putting different sensors into concrete, you can put concrete on the blockchain. Now we're seeing this basically at a minimal level, basically with airports, for example, where once we tag concrete or once we tag different materials and assets that we actually use to create airports, once these are tagged, you can actually give your customers a future market value for the concrete that they've used. So for example, if you were selling $1 million worth of concrete today, you could say, well, in 50 years' time, when we think that you're going to rip the building down, we think that that concrete is going to be worth $250,000. On the one hand, it does allow you to sell concrete in a new way, because as we see with car financing, you could say what we're going to do is we are going to do a residual evaluation. So as a company, rather than paying us $1 million, pay us $750,000 today, and then give us the opportunity to extract the concrete basically from your building, and then we will sell that, and then we'll reclaim our $250,000 down the line. So you do need capital in order to be able to preserve that kind of business model, but none of your competitors are even looking at that business model. So get a point of view. Might be interesting, might not be interesting. You might not do anything with it, you might do, but it could give you a commercial competitive advantage in the marketplace. Now, when we have a look at carbon credits, again, as I've sort of said, carbon negative concrete means that you have the opportunity now to rein in carbon credits. And I think last year you produced about 62 million tons of concrete. So the carbon credits that you could actually earn as a new revenue stream, if you aren't already, could be significant. And that's just in the concrete business, let alone the aluminium smelting business. However, when we actually have a look at the impacts of climate change, there is an increasing need to reinvent concrete. And in fact, even go beyond that, reinvent building materials. And quite a lot of the future building materials that we already see either don't rely too much on concrete or don't rely on it at all. Now, on the one hand, bearing in mind that we are seeing global temperatures increase rapidly. In India, for example, you have a heat wave that is unprecedented. In Spain, we have a heat wave that the Spaniards haven't seen for 20 years. In Pakistan, same with Pakistan. I see in China, we're seeing heat waves. So when we have a look at climate resilient infrastructure, on the one hand, we have cities that are built of concrete, and that concrete is generating huge amounts of heat and capturing it as well. So for example, when I was in Dubai on Friday, Saturday, I sat down on a concrete bench just outside of the Dubai Mall. I felt like I was being welded to it. It was staggeringly hot. Now, when we talk about some of the master builders, for example, in the Middle East, as well as the financiers in the Middle East, we know that the Middle East, let alone the rest of the world, is heating up. Today, more people die from heat exposure in cities than ever before, and it's only going one way. So when we talk about providing concrete that is going to be used to build parts of cities or cities, there is really a need to rethink that concrete so that it doesn't capture huge amounts of heat and release huge amounts of heat into the city's microclimates. On top of that, we also have floods. So for example, in Australia, they have a saying, They say, when the birds stop singing, the roads start melting. So climate change, extreme weather, sea level rise, they're all going to take a massive toll on infrastructure. For example, by 2040, it's estimated that 54 of the world's megacities will generally be underwater to some degree. Now, that means that we have over 1 billion people being displaced. Outside of the fact, basically, that some of these cities are going to almost be too hot to live in. So, climate resilient infrastructure, but in your case, climate resilient materials that reduce heat or that improve, shall we say, local city environments and so on and so forth. This is a massive market opportunity that no one else, as far as I can see, is even moving on. And as I say, for example, in Miami, when we talk about heat traps, Miami itself is now becoming so hot that last year they appointed the world's first chief heat officer. The chief heat officer is there to try to figure out how hot Miami is today, how hot it's going to get in the future, and then try to develop strategies to prevent Miami from overheating. So this is where we talk about greening cities, building cities in new ways, laying out communities in new ways, but also using new materials basically that can cool a city environment as opposed to heating it up, and so on and so forth. We also have adaptive heating materials. So when we actually have a look at some of the new materials coming through, we now have some materials, and these are very new, but we actually have some materials that during the day will absorb heat in a sensible way using far infrared. But at night, they will release that heat actually into space as near infrared, which means that we have the possibility to create buildings that heat and cool themselves passively using no electricity whatsoever. And then if you have a building material that is able to absorb heat and then transmit that heat via thermal inertia to a energy storage system, bear in mind we do see some of these, you could have buildings that absorb heat from the sun, transfer that heat to an energy storage system, and then that energy storage system can release that energy either to the grid or back to the building for whatever reason. So this is where, when we look at the future of materials and things like thermal inertia, very, very new, but quite interesting. Certainly interesting enough in my view, basically to get a point of view on. Now, when we have a look at technology-led change, from a building perspective, we are moving from building buildings the way that we used to, using traditional materials, traditional techniques, to new ways of doing things. So for example, what I'm going to show you shouldn't come as a surprise, is we have the technology today to 3D print buildings. In the US's largest house builder, a company called Lennar, is now 3D printing entire communities. And when you 3D print buildings, you don't necessarily need concrete. And I'll come on to that after this little video. So this is where we are 3D printing a building, but in this particular case, this building is for Mars. So the question I now have for you is, bearing in mind that we are seeing the ability and the maturity of being able to 3D print buildings in Dubai, for example, they are now starting plans to 3D print an 11-story skyscraper. And Dubai wants 25% of all new residential buildings to be 3D printed. When we look at 3D printing, particularly in the construction space, do you have a division or do you have a cluster of people who are looking at creating new 3D printable materials for this growing industry? It's at a very low level at the moment, but investment is now surging beyond tens of billions of dollars. And you can 3D print these buildings up to 95% faster than a traditional building, but you can also 3D print them for about 90 to 95% less cost. It is a disruptive technology to the construction industry. So this is where, when we have a look at 3D printed buildings, which is starting in the residential space, but is increasingly moving into the commercial building space, this is where we need new materials, or have the opportunity to create new materials, new alternatives to concrete. So for example, we can create new binders. We have lavacrete, which is actually being made by Big, who are one of the main 3D printing companies basically in the marketplace now. But we can also create polymer concretes. Now, polymer concretes are where we take recyclable plastics, mix them with different binders and different things to create essentially 3D printed plastic homes. So when I say basically that when we have a look at the future of the construction industry, the future of the construction industry isn't necessarily going to be using concrete. Bearing in mind that when we have a look at the construction industry, it accounts for over 8% of all greenhouse gas emissions. They are very keen to reinvent new materials or invent new materials that have a much more environmentally friendly footprint. Now, this is also where, when we have a look at the ability to 3D print buildings, you can create new 3D printed materials for those buildings that capture carbon, that include bacteria. So again, we have this ability to create carbon negative materials which help us build carbon negative communities, and again, carbon credits come up. Now, when we actually have a look basically at the new materials that we can create, provided they are fit for purpose, in other words, provided they are affordable, safe, durable, reliable, they pass regulatory inspections and so on and so forth, you could arguably create any kind of new construction material that you like. We've even seen in Africa, where we now have organizations in Africa that are 3D printing really quite advanced buildings out of local mud and clay, but again with polymer binders and all that sort of stuff. So for example, when we look at polymers, do you have a polymer point of view? Now in Oman, one of my clients basically is building a new smart city that is 25% the size of Paris. So what they do today basically is, they will order cement that gets shipped to site, so cargo ships, trucks and lorries, but courtesy of organizations like NASA and other organizations like ICON and Big, there is actually the possibility to create new building materials from the deserts around Muscat. So when we talk about green construction is an upticking trend. Now, what we mean by green construction is we are trying to avoid having to transport as many materials as we can to site. So what if you could use the deserts around Muscat as the source of your building material? We have some examples of that. In addition to that, when we actually have a look at new growth opportunities outside of the core, are you looking at autonomous construction? Maybe not. But nevertheless, when we have a look at autonomous construction, we're seeing this on the rise in the Middle East as well as in the US. Do you actually have a point of view? Have you spoken to startups? Is it something that you're interested in? Bearing in mind that you could then end up becoming a vertical stack construction company if you wanted to. So new technologies let us do new things and get new points of view. Remote construction as well. You could have teams sitting in Mumbai that are operating via 5G drone equipment on building sites. I have a variety of different companies that are now doing this. For example, we have organizations, we have some of the world's largest construction organizations, so companies like Arup, Colas, those kinds of organizations, who now are able to clear runways in Africa, for example, or sites in Africa, while their teams are based in the UK. So this is another revenue opportunity for you if you wanted to, if you've got a point of view on it. Maybe you don't do anything with this sector, but could you have a lot of people in Mumbai operating drone machinery, 3D printing buildings, clearing different terrains and so on and so forth? You could. Whether you do, it's up to you. Now, when we have a look at energy generation, there is lots going on in the energy generation market. So last year, we installed over 250 gigawatts of renewable energy and only 65 gigawatts of fossil fuels. Now, bearing in mind that the number of new fossil fuel plants that are coming online has been diving now for 3 years and is only going to get lower, we're obviously switching to renewable energy. But investment in renewable energy is also reaching new highs. From an energy perspective, the energy industry is one of the most innovative industries on Earth. There are more innovations in the energy market today than even we see in the biotech market. So there is a huge amount going on. And again, I won't go through all of it because we're time constrained, but I'm going to go through some. So, for example, we see new genetically engineered biofuels that have 5 to 10 times the energy density of traditional biofuels. We also have new ways to create biofuels. We have hydrogen coming through. So we have especially blue hydrogen, which is taking the lead at the moment. Green hydrogen is a strategic imperative for a lot of governments around the world that see this as a new market opportunity. But the cost of green hydrogen at the moment is 5 times that of blue hydrogen. So we have a lot of governments, particularly Europe and the Middle East, that are now trying to develop new catalysts to get the cost of green hydrogen down. And then they'll export it and that'll be their new markets. We see renewables, so no surprise, 90% of all renewables that are now being installed around the world are wind and solar. Bearing in mind that when we have a look at wind, the cost of wind energy generation is declining substantially as wind turbines themselves get bigger and bigger. So General Electric have just released the world's largest wind turbine. It's 40 stories tall and it can generate energy at a lower cost than any other turbine. We also have a couple of others here, geothermal, and we also have hydro, so pumped hydro especially. We have ammonia coming through. We've got nuclear, which I know that we've talked about before. So this is where organizations like Rolls-Royce are creating mini nuclear reactors, which are commercially available. From an Indian perspective, we've seen developments in thorium reactors. Now, a thorium reactor doesn't need water cooling. We've also seen thorium reactors in China being prototyped and actually being demonstrated. So again, between China and India, there have been some quite interesting developments in the thorium space. And then we have lots of other different sort of energy technologies coming through. Wireless energy probably isn't that applicable to yourselves. But then we also have carbon capture and grid scale storage as well, which are applicable to yourselves. Now, when we have a look at solar, I know that we discussed solar farms basically for some of the new smelting facilities, but you needed too much land. Today, solar energy generation is the cheapest form of electricity generation in over 60 countries. At the moment, we are able to produce solar energy unsubsidized at about $20 per megawatt hour, and that cost is coming down. So when we have a look at the future of the cost associated with renewable energy generation, we can already see a time where the cost will almost be zero, because solar especially is an exponential technology. Now, at the moment, we have solar panels that are commercially available. The record for solar panels, silicon solar panels, is 28% energy efficient. So we're at $20 per megawatt hour with solar panels that are 17% energy efficient. So obviously, as we get higher energy efficiencies from solar panels, the costs plummet. So we've already prototyped solar panels with 48, 80 and 132% energy efficiency. The 132% energy efficient solar panels are made out of a 3D printed material called nanophotonic material, captures the smallest wavelengths of light, and for every photon that hits the material surface, it creates or generates 1.3 electrons, which is how we get solar panels that are 132% energy efficient. And these have already been prototyped. We also have solar panels that you can buy today, but they're not quite commercially available yet, that generate electricity at night, which then reduces the amount of grid scale storage that you need. They can generate electricity when it's cloudy, because we have bacteria in those solar panels. They can generate electricity when it's raining or when it's snowing, because we have a layer of graphene over those solar panels. So increasingly, when we talk about solar panels and the future of electricity generation using these technologies, we get to the point where solar panels will be able to generate decent amounts of electricity at low cost 24/7. Now, when we have a look at heavy asset industries like yourself, so aluminium smelting and so on and so forth, cement production, we have organizations like Heliogen. So Heliogen is a startup that is backed by Bill Gates, and they create something called solar ovens. So you can think of solar ovens as really just taking a lot of mirrors and creating solar concentrators. And the temperatures basically within these solar concentrators are high enough for aluminium, steel, as well as concrete production. But this is green energy technology. So we move away from fossil fuels as our supply. We see wind, huge amounts of wind capacity now coming online globally. And this is obviously going to permeate through to India, basically with Prime Minister Modi's or President Modi's 2070 pledge. We see geothermal. So again, when we have a look at geothermal, the reason why I've included this is there are companies based in the United States that are now starting to roll out new drilling techniques. So when we have a look at the future of mining and tunneling, we have new tunneling and mining technologies that let us go down to 10 kilometers deep. Now, from this perspective, this means that irrespective of where you are on the planet, you'll be able to tap into massive amounts of geothermal energy. So again, it's an energy alternative that you might have looked at, you might not have looked at, but there are some interesting movements in this space. This is more medium and long term than short term, but it's coming. We also have hydrogen, so blue and green hydrogen, mini nuclear reactors, as well as traveling wave reactors, which Bill Gates has funded, and we're now seeing traveling wave reactors being prototyped and rolled out in China because they've allowed it. We actually also see floating nuclear reactors as well, by the way. So we've got a Dutch company that is trialing floating nuclear reactors that you just plug into the local grid and off you go. You get access to X megawatts or X gigawatts worth of clean energy. We see solar fuels coming through. So solar fuels basically are hydrocarbon-based fuels that have been created using water, light, and chemicals. So this is essentially taking things like artificial photosynthesis to create diesel. So when we have a look at this technology, this is where we can create carbon neutral blue and green diesel. So if you are an industry that's stuck on diesel, as well as other hydrocarbon-based fuels, there's a way that we can actually reduce your environmental footprint there. And then coming 2025, and then we'll see these really sort of come through and being scaled through to the 2040s. These have already been trialed. We have the US, the UK, as well as China, who've now committed to spend over $50 billion creating solar power plants in space. The United States has already trialed the technology and they beamed the energy back down to Earth using microwave energy transmission. But with these kinds of technologies, you'll be able to beam up to 6 gigawatts of electricity from space down to a base station, wherever that base station is on Earth. So this is a fun one. You're probably not going to do anything with this one, but it shows just the kind of energy thinking that governments are actually now getting involved with. We also have autonomous grids as well, basically when we talk about the future of energy, and lots of other things. Now, when we're looking at 10xing your business, so finding new revenue streams, what about this one? So I talked about hydrogen. So I would be a bit surprised if blue and green hydrogen weren't an attractive investment opportunity for you, for your energy needs. However, in Saudi Arabia, as part of the NEOM Smart City project, we've seen researchers at KAUST do this. So what they've done is they've created a desalination plant. That desalination plant is exclusively powered by solar electricity. So the solar panels and the solar electricity turns seawater into steam. So we've got a couple of interesting things there. Firstly, this single plant can produce solar power. Secondly, it can create desalinated water that is 60 to 70% cheaper than existing desalinated water. It's a disruptive technology. And we can get into conversations about water as you like. However, we've also seen breakthroughs in new catalysts and new filters, which means that increasingly this plant, as well as other plants around the world, will not only be able to take in seawater and then turn that into fresh water, but the brine output can be filtered for lithium. And then you can take lithium from brine and you can sell lithium on the open market at the moment for about $5,000 per kilo. Bearing in mind that the demand for lithium is increasing and increasing and increasing. So if you were looking at building a hydrogen plant anywhere near the coastline, maybe you are, maybe you're not, there is the possibility that you can use that plant to create solar power that you could use within your business or sell, to create desalinated water that you could sell, and also produce lithium as well as uranium from that seawater that you could also sell. So new revenue streams. Hits lots of things all at once. We've also got virtual power plants. Now, I would be very surprised if you don't have lots of buildings and facilities around the world. This is where organizations like British Petroleum are now investing in virtual power plants because we can turn those buildings into giant batteries. And so rather than building a traditional power plant, we can now turn your buildings and your facilities into power plants with some tweaking, admittedly, and then those can aggregate together all of the renewable energy sources that you and or other people have, and then you can sell that electricity or consume that electricity within your operations. You could also turn that into a new revenue stream because you could end up selling the electricity that you aggregate together and or generate to consumers or other businesses in the area. When we talk about fractionalized ownership, other things that you can do is if you have interesting artificial intelligence algorithms, maybe you have an algorithm that is really good at creating new kinds of aluminium alloy, courtesy of Web 3.0 technologies, you can now do something called fractionalized ownership. So you can take that algorithm, you could sell shares of that algorithm, like we sell shares of a regular company today, but this is where we get into the conversations about tokenization. So when you now sell that algorithm or license that algorithm to other people, the people who've invested in that algorithm automatically get paid out, or payouts, or dividends, etc. So while this is a very new ability, we are seeing billions pouring into tokenization, fractionalized ownership. This is kind of NFTs and that sort of stuff, if you know what those are. So you can tokenize assets in interesting ways. In addition to that, you can tokenize anything within your business, whether it is a physical product or a digital product. And as we're actually seeing in other asset-heavy industries like oil and gas, this one slide gives you the ability as a business to raise capital for new capital-intensive projects like building a factory or whatever, manufacturing plant, without having to go to the banks to raise capital. So new technologies are not only disruptive in new ways, they're also very powerful, but they let us do new things in new ways. So as I say, this one slide has the potential to allow you to raise capital without having to go to a bank. Now, when we have a look at energy storage, there's a lot going on here as well. So for example, we can take bricks, and there's no real reason why we couldn't do this with cement, by the way, but no one's done it yet, but we have done it with bricks. So we've taken red bricks, traditional red bricks, and infused them with carbon nanotubes. So carbon nanotubes are a kind of nanometer scale filament. So if you think basically sort of hair, but on the nano scale, tiny hairs, but they're just carbon nanotubes. By embedding carbon nanotubes into red bricks and other bricks, we turn them into an energy storage system. So what if in your cement business, you could say, one of the reasons why we think you should buy our cement is because it's carbon negative. In addition to that, it also stores energy. It is very cheap grid scale storage, which literally means that if someone is building a skyscraper, as we sort of alluded to earlier, the concrete in the skyscraper is storing energy which can be released to the grid. So the skyscraper is literally a battery. And you can do that with any building. Now, the cost of including carbon nanotubes in red brick is almost zero. So this is not an expensive technology. So I think this is actually worth a look at for the cement business. But you could also do this with new construction materials as well. So the polymers that we mentioned and all that sort of stuff. So there are some interesting synergies here that kill quite a lot of different birds with two stones. Now, we've also got carbon dioxide grid scale storage. Companies like Siemens, they do this in a rather weird way, but we have new methods coming through. Companies with Siemens, basically it's estimated from industry numbers that they are able to store energy in using carbon dioxide at about $118 per kilowatt hour. Now, when you have a look at organizations like the IEA, as well as the US Department of Energy, they want the cost of storing electricity or energy to get to $2 per kilowatt hour. So we are seeing substantial price declines. We're seeing it coming down from about $250 per kilowatt hour at the moment, all the way down to about $100, $120 per kilowatt hour. But we still have work to do. But CO2 energy storage is interesting for a number of reasons. We have iron. Now, depending on the kind of grid-scaled technology solutions that you're looking at or looking for, we have iron batteries. Now, iron batteries, this is an American technology, are based on something called flow batteries. Now, these iron batteries are about a fifth as energy dense as traditional lithium-ion batteries. But the big difference is, whereas a lithium-ion battery can store energy for about 4 hours before having to release it, these can store energy for 12 hours or more. And in fact, there is another organization that says that they can store energy for hundreds of hours at a time. So the reason why this is interesting is because this lets you store energy for a longer time and then release energy whenever you need it, which means that utility companies around the world have a way to get rid of their gas peaker plants. So if you've got gas peaker plants that you rely on, this could let you get rid of those. And this is becoming commercially available as well. They've got about $300 million worth of orders allegedly for this technology. When we have a look at lithium ion, really depending on the statistics that you look at, lithium ion grid scale storage is anywhere between $250 and $110 per kilowatt hour. And in my mind, some of the numbers are quite suspect, and analysts can't quite agree basically where the price point for lithium ion sits at the minute. But generally, this is sort of why we look at CO2 as being one of the lowest energy storage systems that we have today. Courtesy of organizations like Google, we have molten salt grid scale storage. These are quite cheap. They're also becoming commercially available. We have plastic. So organizations like Polyjoule are using plastic to store energy, which can be stored indefinitely. Also, plastic is a very cheap material to produce, and you can also use recycled, what we call PET plastic as well. Now, while this particular grid scale storage technology shows a lot of promise, at the moment the energy density of plastic grid scale technologies is not where it needs to be commercially. But I put this in here because when we're having a look at the future, this is something to keep an eye on and revisit every sort of 6 months or so. So with a lot of these, it's not just about showing you what's here today and showing you what's coming down the line, bearing in mind that costs often fall exponentially. It's also suggesting to you that these are some of the things that you want to get a point of view on, but then revisit occasionally. So maybe not do anything about them today, but now that you know they exist, you can keep an eye on them. We also have water. Now, this might be quite an interesting one. So companies like Carrefour are actually using water as grid scale storage solutions. Because what we do basically is we take that water, we then use energy to turn the water into ice, and then when we need that energy back, the ice thaws and it's released back to the grid. Now, water is very cheap. So while these are still early stage startups with very interesting bank balances and order books in the hundreds of millions of dollar range, this could be quite an interesting one. And it scales at the moment to megawatts. So it could be quite applicable to you guys. We also then have pumped hydro as well, where when we talk about grid scale storage, we just turn the Hoover Dam into a $3 billion battery. We just pump water back up. And then when we need that water, we just release it back down. We also, using that same principle, have what we call gravity power plants. So from a grid scale storage perspective, we can use excess energy from renewable energy generation to lift big concrete blocks up into the sky in cranes. We see these in Switzerland. And then when that energy is needed, those concrete blocks come back down to Earth. and then release energy as we need. So when we have a look at the grid scale storage industry, there's a lot going on. I think there are some technologies that are more likely to be better for the environment and winners from a cost perspective, but some of them are obviously early stage. And then, sort of coming into the final bit now, when we have a look at wastewater treatment, again, there's some quite interesting things happening here. So, for example, and you probably have eyes on these already, but when we have a look at technologies like biotechnological filtration, which is really just a fancy way of saying we use bacteria to clean wastewater, we've seen some quite interesting moves. So normally when we clean wastewater, we use chemicals. And those chemicals aren't environmentally friendly. They are often toxic, difficult to handle, they're expensive to source, and so on and so forth. Bacteria is a biological solution. Bacteria are also very, very cheap to replicate and grow. They, depending how they've been engineered, because we can genetically engineer these bacteria in any way that we like. We've also had, for example, bringing it back to the artificial intelligence piece, we've also recently had an artificial intelligence that designed a new enzyme that can break down plastics thousands of times faster than other technologies. So when we have a look at using biology, so bacteria, to treat wastewater, this ironically ties into an exponential technology trend where this could get better faster. So it's worth watching. Now, in this particular case, we passed the wastewater across bioreactor beds. Bearing in mind that bioreactors are also used in other industries, as well as to solve global famine, taking the cell from a chicken to grow a chicken nugget, that's a bioreactor. So bioreactors also have a play in wastewater treatment. But in addition to that, because we're using bacteria to treat wastewater, we can siphon out all of the harmful materials and chemicals and compounds. And then once we've done that, we can reuse those in a variety of different products. You could maybe put them into construction materials or whatever it happens to be, depending on their toxicity, obviously. So I think this is an interesting one. In addition to that, basically, we've actually seen new breakthroughs in oxidization when it comes to wastewater. Now, there are a couple of companies here, basically, that are able to reduce the capital cost, basically, of wastewater treatment so that's the investment in the equipment, by 30%, but also then cut operating costs by 40%. And then when we have a look at things like nanofilters and nanofiltration, there's been some interesting breakthroughs here as well, particularly with single-step water filtration. And these are where we're developing new membranes to do new things. Now, this again is an early stage technology. It's more aimed at traditional water, grey water, that sort of stuff, than wastewater, toxic wastewater. But nevertheless, basically, there are some interesting breakthroughs here that are probably worth just putting on the radar and getting a point of view on. And so I think that's it for me. So I hope you enjoyed that. As I said, the only thing that is changing is everything. While there are threats to your business, there are also huge opportunities. There's a lot of the things that we've actually discussed are either emerging or new to the market, which also means that from a competitive perspective, your competitors basically probably don't have any eyes on any of these. So thank you very much for listening. And I think we're going to have some breakouts and some Q&As and bits and bobs now.